Welcome to Readers of the Lost Art with your presenter, Dr. Paul Anthony Taylor, a recovering academic. Hi everybody, and today's talk's called Hitchcock's Rear Window, Che voi. And che voi is an Italian phrase which means what do you want, and I think it can also mean what are you saying. And it's nearly always accompanied by the classic Italian gesture with your both your hands, che voi. We're obviously British people. We have the same, basically, arm movements as Irish folk dancers. We don't move our hands at all. We're not very expressive. But it's a classic Italian expression, both physical and verbal. And I think it encapsulates, it's a phrase that's used in psychoanalysis about, Lacan uses or refers to it. I think it was a guy, Antonioni, first used it in a psychoanalytical context. But the concept is, we never really know what the other person wants from us, even if they're our better half, we've known them, intimately and for a long, long time. There's still an element of what does someone want from you. So it seems like an insignificant phrase, but at least in a psychoanalytical context, it takes on a deeper level of understanding or perspective. Now, relevance to Rear Window is that, and by the way, plot spoilers in this episode. So the first episode I've done, and I said there would be 3, there may be more, but I'd really recommend you go and see the film if you don't want me to just completely ruin the plot in what follows. But at the very end of the film, Thorwald, the murderer, comes across the courtyard into the apartment of L.B. Jeffries, and he actually asks, "What do you want from me?" And there's a silence. There's a really, deathly silence. Jeff just ignores him. He has no answer. But you can see how what Hitchcock does in very dramatic form brings a murderer across into your own apartment. We'll be talking about allegory throughout this talk. And allegory is a story that has an underlying message or moral. And with allegory tends to come metaphors and modes of expression that you find in art, literature, poetry, etc. And I would suggest that it's a massive metaphor that Hitchcock's using. Yeah, it's an extreme example. Thorwald, the character, comes across the courtyard and he's murdered his wife, and he comes to confront Jeff. But at a lower level, Hitchcock's trying to entertain people. Hitchcock's produced a mass appeal movie. But one of the issues we'll talk about today is the way in which Hitchcock, more than most directors I know of at least, manages to combine mass appeal with really deep conceptual depth. And I would suggest Thorwald coming across the courtyard is actually quite a good metaphor for what we don't know, what people want from us, even people we're close to. So it's a bit of a red herring, the idea that he's a murderer who comes across. In a certain sense, he also represents the void at the heart of all relationships, the not knowing precisely. No matter how well you know someone, you'll never really know what they want from you. And maybe even they don't, which is one of the topics perhaps we'll approach today. So this concept of che voi. And what I wanted also to do, and I'm going to try different formats, but this talk's based quite closely on, this is an academic paper by a guy, Georgie Tolles. And so as you can see, it's called Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window as Critical Allegory. And what I was hoping the value added I could give you is that I can read various, A, hard to find, B, often quite dense theoretical papers and just pull out the bits that are most relevant to your average intelligent, motivated person who just doesn't have the time to read all this stuff or even find it. And rather than present myself as being some, original genius, if you find a good paper, which I think this is an excellent paper, then why not give it full credit and engage with the ideas presented rather than reinventing the wheel? So I just think it's a brilliant paper that he writes, and he takes a series of perspectives and then he produces his own. And he argues, which I agreed with before I ever read this paper, so it just really chimed with me quite deeply. But this idea that what Hitchcock is doing is telling a story, an allegory, that doesn't at some level matter if the audience gets it, because they'll understand it without the allegorical message. The film is entertaining and it's a thriller, it's full of suspense, but there is this added allegorical level. And Tolles really brings that argument out in his paper, when I'll give you some quite detailed quotes. So I think I showed you this in the previous talk, the idea of Rear Window ethics. And the key thing to take from this, I just wanted to remind you of it, but the key thing is the tripartite structure of the window. So as the film progresses, the blinds go up one after the other. So there's connotations of being in the cinema, being in the theatre. And it's, Alfred Hitchcock's Rear Window, he's, as most directors do, that they're taking ownership of what you're about to see. But I think it's very important you don't forget that behind the seemingly naturalistic presentation of the film, one of the main arguments to be made in this talk is that Hitchcock is very clear with us, the viewer, as to when he's interfering and when he isn't. So he hides things in plain sight. He hides his role as a director by actually, at various points of the film, openly acknowledging he's directing. So keep in mind those three, that tripartite window. And just to give you an idea, because I'll give you some examples from Edward Hopper again, which I've used in the first talk, but I like just going back. And throughout this channel, I will probably circle around. I don't think there's a reason why, if I use a particular artist, I'm not allowed to go back to it. I make the rules anyway, leave me alone. But I'm just going to keep going back to certain artists, because I think repetition is sometimes undervalued. You can maybe overemphasize a point, but also every time you use sometimes the same images, slightly different nuances come out. So I'm partly apologizing, and really I'm not. I think it's important sometimes to not be afraid to go back and back and back to certain key artists. And I just think, with specific reference to Hitchcock, Edward Hopper is just a brilliant artist to go alongside him. But well before, so I mentioned this in the first talk several times, just to date this was 1954, this film, and much, much earlier. This was Caspar David Friedrich, who's an artist I'll come back to quite a bit in the future, no doubt. But I wanted to give you, in the sense that the film is all about Jeff looking out a rear window. So it's about, we get to see behind Jeff's head, we get Jeff's point of view. Sorry, we get to see from Jeff's point of view. And what I'm also trying to ask you to think about is, and I'll show you a picture later on, a production still that shows you Hitchcock behind Jeff doing the actual directing. And this is a classic aspect provided by Caspar David Friedrich, which he did in quite a few of his paintings. This idea about being behind the subject. So we see them as an object in the world, but we also, so they're not us, and that's very clear from the way the painting is constructed. But we also get a sense of what they're seeing, so we get a sense of their subjectivity. And this, it's alike and unlike what Hitchcock does, in the sense that the woman's looking through, it's a tripartite, there's a blind on there's two slats on either side, and there's the middle bit, so there's a tripartite structure to the window, which she's looking out of, which encloses her subjectivity, what she can see of the outside world. And the difference here is, she's looking at nature. She's looking at a vast expanse, the huge empty sky. And then you can see masts of, I'm guessing, sailing boats going past. I think it's the river, was it the Elbe? I think it's supposed to be Friedrich's wife. And apologies if I've got this wrong, but I think he had a studio, was it in Dresden? And so it's a very bare studio, and this is the window she's looking out. And you can see the sense of she's constrained in the immediate physical environment. There's the horizontal skirting on the her knee level roughly, and then there's the casement of the window, and it's like a recess, isn't it? It's set into the wall, so she's enclosed on all sides. And on the right hand side, on the ledge, you can see there are bottles of liquid which catch the light. And I don't know whether that's a metaphor for being bottled up, but I'd suggest there's quite a strong sense in the way the colour of her clothing blends with the background. So she's almost like chameleon-like. She blends in to her interior surroundings, which emphasises the fact she's looking outside at the great beyond. Whereas Jeff, this is the difference, Jeff is looking outside, but at the claustrophobic courtyard, and beyond that, the claustrophobic lives of people who are circumscribed and contained, just like this woman is in this room. Although not quite to the same extent, because this isn't a particularly... I don't think Friedrich's trying to portray that his wife was in a particularly claustrophobic situation, but more so this is the human condition. We have our individual subjectivity that's bottled up, and we also have a role to play out in the world, or we have yearnings, and maybe the way the ship, it's difficult to tell whether the boat is actually moored or moving, so there's that ambiguity. But there's the connotation of perhaps distant places where she'd like to be, or there's the painting reeks with the potential of what's outside. And then what I haven't commented on is the crosshairs effect of the window. And I find this an interesting painting for lots of reasons, but with particular reference to what I'll be talking about today, there's the fact that she is looking through a window. She is framed by that window. She is also in a painting that we're looking of someone looking through a window. And there's the subjectivity encapsulated in the crosshairs. So there's a painting element and there's a window element, and an extra aspect I'll be talking about as we go along is the concept of mirroring, how when we look at things, certain emotions and certain psychological ways of thinking can be reflected back to us. So it doesn't have to be a literal mirror, an actual mirror, but sometimes looking at framed images, like in Rear Window, the windows of the apartments across the courtyard, and by extension, us looking at paintings which are framed like the windows in the courtyard and Rear Window. There is this way in which we bring to the painting our emotions, and certain things are reflected back to us like a mirror, slightly. But I'll hope that makes some sense, but it'll become clearer hopefully as we go along. So this is 1822, and then I did show you previously, but like I say, I quite like to go back and look at other repetitions of the same artist. But this is Edward Hopper's Night Windows. And there's, in Rear Window, there's a theme of fragmentation. So Tollers actually argues at the beginning of his paper, he cites various interpretations of the film, and he says, he gives he relates the notion of a Marxist interpretation of the film and says, there's a fragmentation, all the people, they don't talk to each other much at all. They're isolated, they're fragmented. And the dismemberment theme, the way in which Thorwald kills his wife and dismembers her, from a Marxist point of view, could be interpreted as the fragmentary way in which individual people get psychologically dismembered in this anonymous, urban, anomic environment. So whether you want to follow a Marxist interpretation or not, it just shows you how rich the film is. And in Hopper's paintings, they're often about urban isolation, loneliness, anomie, ennui, all these things. But it's interesting that, they're often about just glimpses caught or voyeuristic fragments of people. So that's not a full woman, obviously. And in Rear Window, you have Miss Torso as the nickname that Jeff gives to the attractive woman directly opposite his flat. But he's reducing her too. But then you do see her framed all the time in her window. So you very rarely see the full, or it's not often, well, you do see the full woman dancing. But I think one of the first times you see her, she's having a shower, and you only see her head, which is an allusion to, what happens to Mrs. Thorwald, potentially. But quite often you only see snippets or bits, and she's reduced through the nickname to this Miss Torso. I think she's often wearing underwear or bikinis that are drawing attention, voyeuristically to her torso. But anyway, before I get too flustered. And again, if I actually go back, what I didn't mention is the obvious point of the 3 windows. So remember the opening credits, it's the tripartite structure again of the windows. And again, and it's a woman in a rocking chair, but I hope you can see the parallels. It's not a million miles from Jeff looking out, and I'll talk about it in future with reference to Giorgio de Chirico, and I'm probably going to do a whole video on, it sounds esoteric, but the whole notion of shade and light. And what I do love about Hopper is the way in which I've got this weird thing where I don't think it's full-on seasonal adjustment disorder, but I actually much prefer winter and autumn. I find the light in summer incredibly harsh, and I can't be alone because Giorgio de Chirico and Edward Hopper here, I find them both amazing artists for how they make sunlight almost seem cold, if that's not a contradiction. And I think there's is it Manet? I'm positive I read a quote from Manet where he talks about he much preferred to paint outdoors if the weather wasn't too bad in autumn and winter, because he found the light, he actually talks about sunlight being too overpowering. And I think he actually uses this oxymoronic phrase, the cold sunlight. And normally sunlight obviously is associated with warmth and happiness and brightness, but Hopper's just got this amazing ability. They're either, even when it's dark paintings he does, you get the sense it's like quite a humid, overpowering summer's night. I can't think of many paintings he does where it's in the middle of winter or it's raining. It always seems to be either a summer's night or summer days like this. But anyway, I think, the parallels with Rear Window, and I have said, and I think it's documented, that Hopper, his work was known to Hitchcock. It influenced the choice of the design of the house in Psycho, based upon a painting I showed in the first video that Hopper did. But I don't think it's a stretch to say this type of painting from Hopper Hitchcock would have been familiar with. So now I want to dive in. I've shown you some images, but dive into the text, and I hope you'll be patient with me because I just think it's worth. Sometimes I don't know whether big chunks of text work, but I do think it'd be interesting to mix up how I approach these films and the various forms of art and the various forms of commentary. So if you'll bear with me, here's a relatively long quote. So rage provides a hidden agenda for all the aimless energy exhibited by the isolated members of this non-community. So he's talking about the apartments on the opposite side of the courtyard. The effort to project one's life outward in such a place results only in one's facing a public void. Recall the outcry of the woman whose dog was killed. The move to inwardness, on the other hand, is consistently portrayed as a kind of anxious invalidism. The theatre of the private self is macabre and hallucinatory, as the behaviour of Miss Lonely Hearts, the Thorwalds, and Jeffries himself attests. So the idea of facing a public void. So in a sense, Jeffries is in his apartment, but there's people all around him. And I think I made the comment in the last video, the idea that, you know, the loneliest place to be sometimes is in the middle of a crowd. And I showed the picture of the composer at a party feeling lonely. But there's when he says, recall the outcry of the woman whose dog was killed. And I think normally it's referred to, if the concept in film theory, there's a notion of an acousmatic voice. I think it's in theatre as well. And an acousmatic voice is this haunting voice. But the definition normally assumes that you don't know its origin, or it doesn't have a readily identifiable origin. So the woman calling out whose dog's killed, it doesn't technically qualify as an acousmatic voice, but it's haunting. It's this direct accusation to all the people in the courtyard that they don't talk to each other, and the dog was the only thing that loved everybody. And if you remember, the party goers at the composer's apartment are all out on the balcony. They look to see what the woman's screaming about. And then you hear someone say it's only a dog. And they all move back in. And I think it's Miss Lonely Hearts and Miss Torso are the only two people who really show much anguish, much empathy with the fact the woman has lost the dog. So you've got it says here, the move to inwardness, on the other hand, is consistently portrayed as a kind of anxious invalidism. So obviously with reference to Jeff in a wheelchair, but you've also got the sculptor, the spinster in the lower left of the courtyard, who's doing a sculpture called Hunger that's missing its stomach. Then you've got the invalid Mrs. Thorwald is in bed. So she's another invalid. And Miss Lonely Hearts is missing. She feels like she's missing a partner. All through, you know, the various aspects of these different apartments, there's various type of invalids, both literal and metaphorical. So the theatre of the private self is macabre and hallucinatory. And I'll talk about this I'm going to do a video about the vampiric nature of Lisa. But at the very beginning, and I'll talk more in depth, at the very beginning of the film, when Lisa, sorry, not the very, very beginning of the film, but close to the beginning of the film, when Lisa first appears, she's almost like a shadow, because she goes across, you see a shadow come across Jeff, who's lying there with a sweaty face, asleep in this heat wave. So right from the early on in the film, you get the sense of the hallucinatory, and initially, like I say, this shadow, and then you get this big blot-like face kisses him, and it's her, and it's only when she backs away that you finally see that she's a beautiful woman. So the way Hitchcock initially introduces her and the experience that Jeff just waking up, it's macabre and hallucinatory. But I'll give you a visual example of this phrase. Where are we? The effort to project one's life outward in such a place results only in one's facing a public void. And I just think this is, again, Hopper to the rescue. So this is a year after Rear Window came out. But I just think it's yet again Hopper's use of this just like alienating brightness of the sun. And there's a woman in a doorway that's simultaneously in shadow and she's exposed to the light. And the windows, always the windows in Hopper. It's like the end of Heart of Darkness. Instead of the horror, it's the windows, the windows. I just don't, I've never seen an artist who makes windows seem so oppressive and malignant. And then in the background, so you've got, obviously it's an artificial scene because it's like a street that just goes off into a prairie. It's like, there's a abyss on the other side. So it's this weird juxtaposition of the endless prairie and the town or the urban. It's the way, but both, there's no, I think the point I'm trying to make is there's no solace in either. You know, Hopper's buildings and urban environments are alienating, but guess what? Nature doesn't provide much light relief either, even though it's innocuous. You know, there's nothing threatening, just the emptiness, the emptiness. And then talking about emptiness. So, you know, I love reading, but even Hopper can make reading a book look bloody depressing. And again, there's the blind in the background and just the absolute void of the night. So you could argue, you know, there's not an immediate reason to assume that's particularly depressing, but because there's a woman on a bed reading a book. But in the light of all his other paintings, which I could give you example after example, maybe I've just seen too many Hopper paintings, so I'm primed to see them as all about alienation. But in case, you know, you think I'm exaggerating, you know, these are not cheery paintings, but again, the light, the window, and then on the outside, the stone structure, like the brown face, I think they're called in America. And behind, so you've got these like slabs of concrete, or stone, sorry, I think they are. And then in between those, maybe granite perhaps, you can see fragments of yet more windows. Just the you know, it's like an homage to rectangles in a really oppressive, and, you know, another rectangle above the chest of drawers with no discernible, it's very blurred picture. The rectangle of light in the, what looks to be a curtain, is it? Or a door? I think it looks like a curtain. There's parallelograms or, you know, rectangular-ish, quadrilateral-ish shapes that the light is making on the window casement on the carpet. And as you do, at 11 a.m, you sit there naked in an armchair. But to bring all this back to the actual film, I can hear even they having a go at me. You know, what's all this got to do with Hitchcock? So all this again is that most of the quotes, unless I say otherwise, are from the George Toller's, or Tolles, however you pronounce his name, article that I cited at the beginning. Rear Window's continuing power over many of us lies, I am convinced, in its profound intuition of the self-deceiving uses vision rationally proposes for itself. The film's form carries this knowledge, about whose implications interpreters can never pose too many questions. If one wants to disentangle some portion of this issue, the only place to begin is with our blurred images of self. One must be willing to re-examine the suspect ways in which the self constantly exchanges its confusions for fantasies of settled order, and out of this order contrives a limited world to inhabit. If our language is not to grow tyrannous in its manipulation of what we perceive, our theoretical persuasions, with their growing vested interests, must initiate challenges from within to their own authority. The practiced ease of any method is the greatest threat to its continued ability to say things that matter. It is precisely this ease that we need to oppose. So just to break that down, what Tollers argues in the article as a whole is that Hitchcock is constantly aware of, and within the film commenting upon, how he's directing the film. And I'll discuss it in detail, but the ending, for example, I would argue there's a very easy ending to assess and just say that he closes up all the plot lines and everyone's happily ever after in various ways, although you could debate that, because ironically the newlyweds look like they're on a relationship's going downhill very quickly, because you've seen them have the honeymoon period and already you're getting hints. I think at one point is his name Harry, I think. She goes, Harry, calls him back, and he looks absolutely shattered. And you can just tell that's a voice he's going to hear for a long time into the future. But that's the end, where all these, mostly everything's tied up neatly in a bow within the film's storylines. But also, are they really? So when we do the video on the vampiric nature of Lisa, at the end of the film, I'd argue that the clue is that, or the intimation is that she's misled Jeff, and that she's pretended to be something that he would find attractive just so that she could get him, capture him. And then remember at the very end, she's reading something about the Himalayas, a travel book, and then the minute she's confident that he's fully asleep, she switches it for Harper's Bazaar, a fashion magazine, implying she hasn't really changed at all. So that's just one little element. But the whole undercurrent that this quote's trying to get across is that the film is, by its nature, ambiguous. And I'll give you specific examples to flesh out what's meant in this whole quote. So rather than it just remain abstract, to give you specific examples. But if you just take it for the moment on trust that Tollers here is right, that you can't, as I keep doing videos on this one film, it's pretty good evidence when he says that whose implications at the beginning, interpreters can never pose too many questions. There's just endless interpretations if you look deeper at what the film can mean and what it says about Jeff's state of mind and his condition. And Tollers is arguing that the only place to begin is with our blurred images of self. So what he's suggesting is the film is all about Jeff looking out at other people, but actually, as we'll discuss when we discuss the very end, when Thorwald comes after him, it's also about his lack of understanding of himself and the fact that Lisa goes to the other side of the courtyard, and that's when he begins to find her attractive, when she's interested in what he's investigating and she goes across to be part of it, the spectacle for him. Now that, if he was able to reflect upon, rather than just looking at reflections of his own desire, which is Lisa going over to the other side, if he was more able to reflect upon what he really wants from himself, remember Kay Voy, what do you want? But I don't think Jeff, he's struggling with what he wants himself. And the relationship between Lisa and Jeff, as it's portrayed, Lisa is struggling to understand why Jeff doesn't want her. So she's thinking all the time, Kay Voy, what do you want? Why isn't it that you want me? But then towards the end of this quote, I really just liked, and why I think it jumped out at me, the last sentence: the practiced ease of any method is the greatest threat to its continued ability to say things that matter. It is precisely this ease that we need to oppose. And I think we're talking about a film that Hitchcock did, but the extent to which most films lend themselves to a very easy understanding, like the end of Rear Window could lend itself to a very easy understanding, but actually, for all the reasons we'll look into, it's much, much more complicated. But I would also argue, to expand this on a much wider basis, a lot of the problems with contemporary society are about the lack of interrogation of our founding assumptions of most things. So we live in an environment that's constantly dominated by, in other videos I've called it insta-angst, but instantaneous images all the time that purport to be self-evidently true, that we don't question them because they're so self-evidently true, or they appear to be. And the dominance, whatever your politics, just the dominance of ideological ways of thinking, partisan thinking, that's just, it's easier to think ideologically and to have all the answers already there for you than to actually, what he's saying here is precisely this ease that we need to oppose. So this is just to show you, this is a production picture to give you a clue of, I mentioned before that, Hitchcock is behind Jeff's head. And you can see in his hand, he's got a microphone stroke radio. I think it was the short wave radio system he had. So he could talk to people on the other side of the courtyard, the actors and actresses. But I just think it's nice to see this because it really reinforces the idea that it's almost like, because we see everything approximately from Jeff's point of view, you forget the extent to which Hitchcock is directing all of this. So he's physically directing it in this, he set up the whole courtyard, Hitchcock. I think there were 31 apartments that they had furnished and full lighting capability on. But it was a huge, stage set. And then, so that's the practical control that Hitchcock had over the actual physical environment of the film set. But then he also, before we get to see Jeff's point of view, when he wakes up at the beginning, there's these narrative pointers. So when the camera pans at the beginning across the apartment, to remember Jeff isn't awake at this point, but you have these visual clues. You guess what you get to see. You get to read, here lie the bones, the broken bones of L.B. Jeffries on his cast. You then see clues like this. So he's obviously had an accident. Looks like one of the wheels has hit him. But it's also staged. So, for example, that would not be, I'm convinced that would not be the type of camera that he would have been using when the accident happened. So that's staged. I think that's Hitchcock drawing attention to even the clues that he's providing. Before Jeff wakes up, we, the viewer, get to deconstruct what's happening. Or we get all the clues to assemble about Jeff. But I think this is a little indicator that amidst the clues, there's additional meta clues. That this is all Hitchcock's, manipulation. Because I hope you do get my point. That looks like a very old-fashioned camera that wouldn't have the shutter speed, to get technical, to produce the image that you can see above it. And then there's, not so subtle commentary, allegorical commentary through the movie. So this is an itch that he just can't scratch, which is, not that subtle a reference, I'd argue, to the way in which his itch to observe what's going on the opposite side of the courtyard is an itch he can't scratch. It keeps itching him. And then there's a narrative structure in the film, and in the other videos, I'll go into more precise depth about, various subtle and precise aspects of the film. But this is very early on, and it's two women, and the implication is they take off those linen or cloth pajama type things, and then they'll be either naked or wearing skimpy bikinis as they sunbathe. And there's quite an funny intertextual reference, because over above, when they sunbathe, you can see the special effects are awful by modern standards, but a helicopter comes, and so the helicopter pilot can leer at them. So even in the top of the building, on a roof, where you'd think you would be free from prying eyes, even then, Hitchcock's making the point that he'll introduce a random helicopter. But this, 6 years later in 1960, Fellini's La Dolce Vita film, if you watch, you can get it on YouTube. If you watch the opening of La Dolce Vita, there's a beautiful scene. It's a beautifully shot film in black and white. But there's two helicopters, one of which, bizarrely, has a huge statue of Christ the Redeemer, stone statue. They're transporting it, and it's hanging from one of the helicopters, and the helicopter flies past Roman aqueducts or viaducts, and you see all the aspects of Rome, and there's people below running, like little kids shouting at the helicopters. And it's quite a joyful scene where you get the backdrop of the history and the beauty of Rome. And then there's some Italian women sunbathing in bikinis on a rooftop, and I think it's a reference to this. The helicopter stops, the one that doesn't have the statue, and he tries to get the phone number. I'm not saying there are any national stereotypes on show from Fellini, but he tries to chat up the sunbathing women, and they're mouthing. You can tell they're trying to lip read, but because they ask him where's he taking the statue, and he goes, "Il Papa," the Pope. But it's just a truly bizarre scenario that's beautifully shot, but it strikes me that it's just far too oddly similar to this. So it's like Fellini having a joke about Hitchcock's joke. But anyway, this is the top of the building. So what I'm suggesting is there are layers, and then the middle of the building. So these are arguably the most attractive, seemingly available, unspoken for women at the top level of the building. And then you have Miss Lonely Hearts, and to the right you have the Thorwalds. So you find out by the end of the film that this is that Miss Torso here is married. But if this, you couldn't find a much better example of a picture to summarize the concept of rear window. And well, I'll talk about in another video the constant accusation that Hitchcock was a misogynist, which I wouldn't dispute, but I would qualify it by pointing out I think the man was a weird sadist with everyone. Lots of male actors complained about his weird sadistic way, but obviously he had a thing about women. But like I say, I think this is a visual joke on the concept of rear window. So this is the middle. So these are a highly attractive woman, but who's not available. And Mrs. Thorwald obviously is not available because she's dismembered not long after this. And then the basement level, you have Miss Lonely Hearts. But what I'd point out here is the extent to which, because I'll be talking a second, or Tolles in his article cites a quote from a guy called Albert Cook all about mirrors and paintings. And this just strikes me immediately almost like a painting. And I am conscious, I'm showing you lots of images, still images from Rear Window. But more than most films I can think of, it lends itself to that. Because although it's a piece of cinema, it's a movie of obviously moving images, there are so many set framed pieces like this. And even the way the curtains are lit. And she's framed in the square. I'd suggest it's almost like a gilt edging on a painting. And that's what I'll shortly talk about, is insofar as the opposite wall, the opposite apartments of the courtyard represent Jeff's psychological projection and his state of mind. So there's a mirror element. There's also Jeff looking at images like this, which I'd suggest are like paintings. So it's a beautiful, beautiful film in the way there's an element of theatre, the courtyard, almost like a stage. There's elements of mirroring and Jeff seeing aspects of his own desire across the way. There's like TV screens represented in the framing of the windows on the opposite side. And then there's still images like this, the way in which the frames could almost be seen as paintings. So there's lots of visual levels to Hitchcock that I just think when you put them all together, it's so artfully done. And this is Towles talking again about the film. A mystery whose solution has seemed to depend on the gathering of external data conceals, but also discloses to those moved to attend to it, a more basic mystery of perception. How our window on the world out there ceaselessly transforms into a mirror of our desires and perceptual habits. So this is what I've been saying. Towles is talking about the way in which the opposite side of the courtyard is a mirror for the way in which Jeff desires Lisa. He only desires her. When she's in the apartment, she's too close. She's like this blot that you first see. That the blot when she first leans in to kiss him is representative of how he almost sees her when she's moving around the apartment. She's like a blot on his apartment landscape. And when she moves over and she moves into his field of interest, suddenly they begin to bond. But I'll talk about this in a lot more depth when I talk about the vampiric nature of Lisa. So this is a classic, and again, it's, you know, perfect. I think they used a very similar image in one of the advertising stills, one of the adverts. So it's obviously an emblematic picture to sum up Jeff's voyeurism. And he's almost metaphorically castrated, sitting there with a big cast on his leg. But this is his big phallic lens to compensate. And notice in the actual lens of the camera, you can see when I'm talking about, I was initially talking metaphorically that the opposite side of the courtyard is a mirror for his desire. But in this actual picture, that metaphor is made literal in the actual lens of the camera. And again, to show you how deliberate all this was, this is another production still. This is how they got the image onto the lens of the camera. They had James Stewart looking at a cinema projection of the courtyard that in reality he's looking at through the window. So with the proper lighting, they could get this cinema projection to be reflected on the lens of the camera. So I guess some people, when you do like really in-depth analyses of films like this, they'd say, oh, well, it's not what the author meant, so it's not what the director intended, which is called the authorial fallacy, because often directors can't fully consciously verbalise what they intuitively have portrayed. But I just think this is a great production still, because it shows you quite emphatically the lengths to which Hitchcock went to reflect upon the reflections that are in the camera lens that simultaneously reflect Jeff's state of mind, his psychological yearning for Lisa, as the opposite wall of the apartment being the space into which she moves, and then he desires her. So I won't go on for much longer, but here is quite a long quote. And this is, I'm giving you the full quote. Towles, in his article, gives a segment of this quote, but I went to the original article by Albert Cook and got the whole quote that I quite liked. So, the mirror draws colours into itself, but it is uncannily itself without an initial coding. The completed painting is a mirror too, since it gives back the world and arrests the viewer into a social set, the function of painting in his society, and perhaps also into contemplation. In a painting, though, the mirror-like image is already fixed. It doubles the world, but not the face of the viewer, except by the implication that a doubled object means only what the face of the viewer can bring to it, while standing in the absence of what the doubling frame, the mirror, can usually give him, a direct representation of his own face. The window, by contrast, gives on part of the wide world beyond, or stains some of that out in the stained glass window, or curtains off much of what a private world within has organised, if the window is seen from inside. Two-way mirrors are a trick, but two-way windows are normal, and they must be specially curtained and angled if they are not to permit an excessive intrusion on privacy. Unlike the mirror, the window does not seem to be a surface or to allow for such radical changes of perspective. So I'm sorry it's a bit of a mouthful, but why I just think, and I will go into lots of depth on this in future videos. So for example, this relationship between windows and mirrors, and I would also say windows, you can also sometimes use doors, not just windows in this type of context. So an immediate painting that comes to mind would be Las Meninas by Velázquez. And I will do a full video on that, because it may not seem to the lay person that, you know, all right, what's so significant about windows or mirrors? But this is just like a small indication. This quotation gives you a sense of how, if you actually begin to think about it, windows and mirrors and the relationships between windows and mirrors are quite complex. So the first sentence, the mirror draws colours into itself, but it is uncannily itself without an initial coding. In other words, it's a completely passive, reflective surface that doesn't have a colour of its own. The completed painting is a mirror too, since it gives back the world and arrests the viewer into a social set. So there is a mirror-like element of a painting. And one way to think about this, for example, I'm always fascinated by a portrait. If you think if someone does a portrait of you, in a sense, it's a mirror image, but in another sense, it's not, because there's something unique about painting that manages to capture the essence of someone in a way that a snapshot or you looking in the mirror doesn't really achieve the same thing. So it's a paradox, it's a contradiction. You would think a portrait would be less accurate than looking in the mirror, or less accurate than a snapshot, which is a chemical representation of physical reality when the photograph was taken. Oh, sorry, when I say chemical, when you had single lens reflexes or film that needed developing. Obviously now they're all digital. So you've got the digital capturing of reality and the lighting and everything that was in the world at that time. Whereas a painting is an artist's impression, but within the artist's condensed impression of you, the person. If they're a good painter, they encapsulate part of your character that a mirror or a photograph just couldn't hope to. So in a painting, though, the mirror-like image is already fixed. It doubles the world, but not the face of the viewer. So you're not looking in a mirror, you're not seeing your own direct face, except by the implication that a doubled object means only what the face of the viewer can bring to it, while standing in the absence of what the doubling frame, the mirror, can usually give him. So this, in a way, is what I was just saying. When you're standing in front of a painting, you're not getting the direct reflection you would be if you were standing in front of a mirror. But you are seeing something and you're bringing something in order to make sense of the painting that you're seeing. And that painting stands in the absence, so it stands in for what you would see if you were looking in a mirror, but it's a representation, an artist's representation of, in a portrait, yourself instead of a mirror. Or if it's nothing to do with you, if it's just an artist painting something within a frame, it's a piece of the world that's captured, but not like a photograph and not like a mirror. The window, so against all of this, the window by contrast gives on part of the wide world beyond. So like Caspar David Friedrich's wife looking out. But then you've got, I just think it's interesting, historically you've had in churches stained glass windows. So a stained glass window is fascinating because they deliberately portray images on a window that's partly transparent, so you get a sense of the outside world, but that outside world is stained deliberately by the stained glass, which enables the images on the surface of the stained glass to interact with the outside. So that's, if you alter the glass itself, that affects a window. But then you've got the issue of curtains, so, or curtains off much of what a private world within has organised if the window is seen from inside. So the point he's making is, if you're inside a room, the view you get outside the window is part of your perspective, but you're also seeing the rest of the room. Whereas the person on the other side of the window looking into the room won't get your whole view of that interior room. So two-way mirrors are a trick, but two-way windows are normal. In other words, that's what tends to happen. The person looking into a window, into a room through a window, sees less of the room that you're in. Whereas you in the room see more of the room, but you can only see a small frame of the outside world. And they must be specially curtained and angled if they are not to permit an excessive intrusion on privacy, which is one of the ironies of Rear Window. Everyone seems to be completely oblivious to the fact that everyone, or anyone sitting where Jeff is, can see lots. Although, to be fair, he does use binoculars and a telephoto lens. Unlike the mirror, the window does not seem to be a surface or to allow for such radical changes of perspective. So, again, I will go into even more, you'll be chuffed to hear, in other videos, but that gives you a sense of how actually complicated windows, mirrors, notions of privacy, reflections, different perspectives from inside the room, looking out the window, outside the room, looking through the window. It's much more complicated than you might initially think. And I think Hitchcock's used all of these ambiguities in his actual filming. And then with reference to the concept of allegory, a viewer or reader must be prepared to recognise an allegory as a specialised form of discourse, something which demanded of him an unusual mode of thought. Otherwise, despite what natural qualifications he might have, he will react to a poem with limited comprehension of its analogical truth. The non-recognition of allegory, however, in no way prevents the viewer or reader from taking delight in the work or from feeling that he understands it perfectly in his own terms. The extraordinary imaginative resonance of a Hitchcock film derives, I think, from his matchless ability to hide things in plain sight, to create open stories that are entirely taken up with subtle acts of concealment. And you've seen Jeff with his phallic telephoto lens, but, you know, that is extended yet further by Alfred Hitchcock, who's a little man, portly man, but this is his big phallic camera. You see if you can beat that for size. So I'll quickly wind up now. So I think that it's too much text can be a bit tiring, but this is an important element. A Hitchcock text perfectly fulfills Paul de Man's conditions for the essence of the literary. It is a text that has no blind spots, that implicitly or explicitly signifies its own rhetorical mode and prefigures its own misunderstanding as the correlative of its rhetorical nature. Thus we have Hitchcock almost wholly submerging his camera mirror from the end of the film's prologue until the point when the woman in black leaves with Thorwald, when we become conscious that the camera in Jeffrey's window is sole witness. The smooth advance of the naive genre film has been a calculated misunderstanding of the prologue. Now, just to explain this, what he's actually saying is, I don't think you need to worry too much about the Paul de Man, the essence of the literary, except to say, as I've mentioned in previous videos, postmodernism gets a bad rap because through people like Paul de Man and Derrida, this idea of constantly deconstructing everything and there's no real meaning and there's no real truth, that's often the caricature of postmodern thinking. But what Tolles is saying is that when we have this Hitchcock almost wholly submerging his camera mirror, what he's saying is, at the very beginning of the film, when Jeff's sitting in the chair with his back to the courtyard, we are under the control of Hitchcock, the director. We are being shown what Jeff cannot see because he's asleep. And then when Jeff wakes up, the whole of the rest of the film for quite a while is Jeff's point of view. But then the reference here, in the middle of the night, Thorwald leaves with a woman wearing black. You only see the back of her and you don't know for sure who she is. And at that point, that's not Jeff seeing that. That's Hitchcock reinserting himself as director to show us, he's showing us elements that Jeff's not aware of. So that's Hitchcock once again being present. So from when Jeff wakes up to when Jeff falls asleep and you see Thorwald with the woman in black, that's all one point of view of Jeff. But what Tholles is saying here is the smooth advance of the naive genre film has been a calculated misunderstanding of the prologue. So he's saying that in some ways Hitchcock has tricked us into taking Jeff's point of view, having forgotten that initially we were shown Hitchcock's direction. And this is just an example of the way in which Hitchcock is constantly aware of the fictional quality of what he's doing and how he can manipulate an audience. So at the very end, this is Tolles quoting Philip Fisher, but too many connections call connection itself into doubt in a final way that is more threatening than the early isolation, always pregnant with hints and possibilities of connection. So what Fisher's saying here is, when we don't quite know what's going on, when Jeff's looking out trying to piece together everything, that's quite reassuring because we, the viewer, are brought into Jeff's efforts and we, with him, try and make sense of what's going on. But at the very end of the film, Hitchcock ties up all the loose ends too neatly. So this idea that too many connections call connection into doubt in a final way that is more threatening than the early isolation. So Fisher's arguing that Hitchcock oversimplifies the ending, and the effect of oversimplifying it is to actually make us doubt and to actually think that actually it might be more complicated, because he's overcompensating Hitchcock by tying up all the loose ends. Miss Lonely Heart finds her new beau in the composer. I think, am I imagining, but don't they, the couple who lost the dog, don't they have a new dog? Apologies if I've misremembered that. What else? Lisa now gets Jeff. So that loose ends tied up. You see the husband coming back of Miss Torso, and there's a joke in that because the husband's quite short. He's like a stand-in for Hitchcock. And if you notice, he goes straight to the fridge. And remember, the spinster's sculpture is called Hunger. And if you also remember, Miss Torso is constantly eating throughout the whole film. And that's their husband comes back, who you think is a bit out of her league, and he goes straight to the fridge because he's obviously hungry. So even when that's neatly solved, you see Miss Torso has a partner. There's yet more questions thrown up. Really? She's settled for him? But the biggest question is, and I just think it's the most beautiful part of the film in a macabre way, is when Thorwald comes back across the courtyard and he enters the apartment, and it really emphasizes, if you think about it, there's only about 3 steps that separate Jeff from being able to close his apartment door, which he briefly tries to and just realizes he's not going to do it in time because he's so incapacitated. And this is when he's in the dark, and Thorwald has said to him, "What do you want from me?" And there's just this moment where there's just silence. Jeff doesn't have an answer. And remember, it would be falsely simple. It would be a too easy a connection to make just to think that Thorwald is only a murderer. He's also, I would strongly argue, he represents the unknowability of anybody who comes back from that fantasy space, just like Lisa also came back from that fantasy space, and she's now back in the apartment. So this prefigures, at the end of the film, you see Lisa sat comfortably while Jeff's asleep. Well, I don't think it's an exaggeration or too much of going out on a limb. Thorwald coming across, it prefigures Lisa coming back and getting her feet under the table. And that's what I'll be talking about when I look at the video that addresses Lisa the Vamp, or Lisa the Vampire. So I'll just leave you with the final shot that just absolutely summarizes. And remember, I'm arguing Thorwald as a stand-in for every single romantic relationship. So I'm not claiming that every romantic relationship is based upon a psychopathic murderer's mentality. I'm not quite saying that, but what I am saying is, as you can see in this final image, there is this dark, disturbing notion when someone says, "What do you want from me?" Que voy?